A man named Erling Solberg paid $50 for a cabin nobody wanted. That was in the spring of 1961, outside Bottineau, North Dakota, when the Hagen family finally broke up the last piece of their grandmother's homestead. The grandchildren, none of them had ever spent a winter in that valley, looked at the low, odd-shaped structure and saw a liability. It sat at an angle nobody could explain. The logs were short and stacked crosswise, end grain out, nothing like the horizontal log cabins every other Norwegian family in McHenry County had built. The chinking had a strange smell. The walls were 2 feet thick. 3 generations had lived inside it, and none of them could say exactly why their grandmother had built it the way she did, or where she had learned how. Erling Solberg was a retired postal worker from Minot who collected unusual buildings the way other men collected stamps. He had bought an abandoned grain elevator in 1952, a failed dry goods storefront in 1957, and a stone and mortar root cellar in Bottineau County that dated to approximately 1875 and whose construction method nobody he asked could identify. He had a careful man's habit of paying attention to what things were made of, not just what they were used for, but the material itself, the way it held up, the way it aged against a climate that aged everything hard. He paid the grandchildren $50, shook hands, and drove home thinking he had bought himself a shed. When he started pulling out the south wall to repair it, he found the first bottle, then another. Then something wrapped in oilcloth that had been set into the mortar cavity between the inner and outer mortar courses, deliberately, carefully, placed there during construction and sealed inside for at least 60 years. He stopped working that afternoon and sat on an overturned bucket in the yard and tried to understand what kind of woman would build a wall like that. What kind of woman hides something in the mortar of her own cabin and then never tells her children what she did? What kind of winter, what kind of fear, what kind of knowledge would lead a person to build walls 2 feet thick when everyone around her had built walls 6 inches thick and called it fine? Her name was Astrid Hagen. She arrived in Dakota Territory in October 1883 from Hallingdal, Norway, age 34. With $11 and a memory of how her father had built walls in a valley where the wind came off the Hallingdal plateau at temperatures that would kill a man in 40 minutes. She was a widow by November of that same year. And what she built in that valley, outside Bottineau alone, over one winter, from materials most settlers considered waste, kept her alive through a storm in January 1888, that killed somewhere between 235 and 500 people across the Great Plains in a single afternoon. This is her story, but it is also the story of what she built and why it worked, and why the people around her had no idea what they were looking at until the night the temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes, and the wind started sounding like something that wanted to come through their walls. There is something you need to understand about dead air before this story makes sense. Heat moves through solid material by conduction, molecule to molecule, contact to contact. Put your hand against a stone wall in January and the heat bleeds out of your palm steadily, predictably, because stone conducts well and your hand has no choice but to keep feeding warmth to the cold mass touching it. Now put your hand 6 inches away from that same wall. The air between your hand and the wall is the same temperature as the air in the room, and you feel nothing, the hand stays warm. Air conducts heat so poorly that even a thin layer of it acts as a thermal barrier between you and the cold surface. The problem with air as insulation is that it moves. When air moves, when it circulates, convects, flows through gaps, it carries heat with it, and the insulating effect collapses. This is the entire premise of wind chill. The air itself is not especially cold. It is the constant replacement of the thin, warm layer next to your skin with new cold air that strips heat away so fast it can kill. Moving air is one of the most efficient heat removal systems in nature. Still, air is one of the most efficient insulators. The secret of good frontier construction was finding a way to make the air stop moving. Sawdust does this, moss does it. Loose fill of almost any organic material does it. The material itself has modest insulating value, but the millions of tiny pockets of air trapped between the particles, too small for convection currents to form, add up to something remarkable. In 2004, two researchers at the University of Manitoba, Dr. Chris J. Dick and Luke Chaput, tested a 2-4-inch cordwood wall in winter conditions. Their measured result, R35. For reference, a standard modern wall with 2x6 studs and fiberglass insulation achieves roughly R15 to R20. The 2-4-inch cordwood wall short log ends, packed in mortar with a sawdust-filled cavity, was performing nearly twice as well as the best standard residential construction in North America today. Astrid Hagen had never heard of R values. She would not have known what the term meant. But she had grown up in a valley in Hallingdal, Norway, where her father built walls 2 feet thick with a lime sawdust mortar that had a faint vinegar smell when fresh, and where their house stayed warm with half the firewood their neighbours burned, and where she spent her winters watching her father tend a single small fire with the satisfaction of a man who understood something the others did not. She carried that knowledge across the Atlantic. She carried it to Quebec, where she worked 3 years as a domestic before she had enough money to travel west. She carried it to the Red River Valley, where she met a Norwegian farmer from Seljord named Carl Hagen, who was filing a homestead claim in the new settlements opening up along the Souris River drainage in what would become McHenry County, Dakota Territory. They married in the spring of 1883, and she followed him to the claim that fall, and 6 weeks after they arrived, Carl Hagen died of pneumonia at age 41. He had been coughing since the ocean crossing, 3 years before Astrid even met him. She knew this when she married him. She had decided the claim was worth the risk. She had decided wrong, or she had decided right, she was never fully sure which. But she was on 160 acres of Dakota Territory prairie in October 1883, a widow with $11, a team of 2 horses, a plough, an axe, a Norwegian auger set, and a complete understanding of how her father had built his walls in Hallingdal. The claim was in a shallow valley, not dramatic topography, just a gentle depression in the rolling prairie, where 2 seasonal drainage channels converged. There was a grove of box elder and cottonwood along the lower drainage, nothing like the birch and spruce of Hallingdal, but workable. There was a natural windbreak on the northwest side, where the land rose slightly, and a band of planted shelter trees from a failed earlier claim had taken root and reached 8 feet. This mattered. A grove of trees 8 feet tall is not a forest. It would not stop a Dakota Territory wind, but it would slow it. Wind slowing around a windbreak does something predictable. It creates a pressure shadow on the leeward side where the velocity drops, and in that shadow the wind chill drops with it. A wind at 40 miles per hour, with a temperature of 20 degrees Fahrenheit, produces a wind chill equivalent of approximately 53 degrees Fahrenheit. That same wind, reduced to 25 miles per hour, by a windbreak produces a wind chill of 41 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference of 12 degrees is not trivial. It is the difference between frostbite in 12 minutes and frostbite in 20. Over a winter, that shadow adds up to weeks of reduced heat loss from any structure built inside it. Astrid Hagen had looked at that grove of stunted shelter trees the same way she looked at the short cottonwood logs along the drainage, not with the eye of someone surveying landscape, but with the eye of someone solving a problem. She had been solving the same problem since she was 9 years old in all, watching her father position the barn so its long axis ran perpendicular to the prevailing Hardangervidda wind. You do not fight the wind in Norway. You live next to it and use what you know. Carl had filed the claim in the summer and had done 2 things before he died. He had turned over 14 acres with the plough, enough to demonstrate improvement to the land office inspector, and he had made a deal with a neighbouring homesteader named Gustaf Torgerson for timber rights on a strip of river-bottom land 2 miles east. Torgerson had more cottonwood than he could use and was glad to trade cutting rights for a half-day of ploughing. The cottonwood was Astrid's building material. She spent November and early December of 1883 cutting it, not in long horizontal logs, the way American settlers cut cabin timber, but short, 18 inches. The length her father had used in Hallingdal, which was also the length he said was right for the mortar to hold through freeze and thaw cycles. She cut more than she needed. She cut until she had over 800 18-inch sections stacked in rough rows, bark stripped in the first weeks of October when the sap was still running and the bark came off clean. She was cutting them to dry. Green wood shrinks as it dries, and shrinking wood pulls away from its mortar bed and opens gaps. Her father had been emphatic about this. The wood had to be dry, or the wall would crack open in its first winter and let in the cold as if there were no wall at all. She had until late winter to build. She spent the fall cutting and stacking in the shelter of the box elder grove, wood ends exposed to the dry prairie air, to let it cure. Cottonwood is not the ideal species for this type of construction. The preferred woods cedar, white pine, spruce have tighter grain, lower moisture content when green, and shrink less dramatically as they dry. Cottonwood is softer, more prone to checking the long radial cracks that open in log ends as moisture escapes, and its end-grained surface takes mortar with less reliability than cedar's tighter pores. Her father had used Norwegian pine, which is close to spruce in its behaviour and very different from cottonwood. She knew this. She adapted. For the checking problem, log ends that split open as they dry, creating gaps in the mortar bed, she wedged shallow cuts in an X pattern across each end grain face with a hatchet before stacking, giving the wood a pre-controlled cracking path that would relieve drying stress without opening random splits. Her father had not done this. In Norway, pine logs dried slowly enough in the cool summer air that checking was rarely severe. Dakota Territory, in October, dried wood hard and fast, and she had learned on a test stack of 20 sections in early October that the uncut cottonwood was checking badly at the centres. The X-scored sections held. She lived in a dugout. Carl had started that first summer. 3 sides were earth, 1 side was plank. It was cold, and it was dark, and the dirt floor turned muddy when the temperature went through freeze cycles, and the plank wall leaked wind. But it was below grade by about 4 feet, and below grade the earth stays warmer. The frost line in McHenry County reaches perhaps 5 or 6 feet in a severe winter, but above that depth the earth buffers against the extremes, and 4 feet of earthen wall acts as insulation that no amount of Dakota wind can strip away. She was uncomfortable in the dugout. She was not in danger of freezing. Her nearest neighbour to the north was Gustaf Torgerson, half a mile across the drainage. To the south, about 3/4 of a mile, was a family named Blumenkrantz, a German-American couple, Heinz and Marta, who had been on their claim 2 years and had built a respectable single-pen frame cabin with sawn lumber purchased in Minot. They burned through about 6 cords of cottonwood per winter and supplemented with dried buffalo chips they collected in autumn. They had a decent stove, a good door, and glass windows. They were the standard. They were what success looked like on the southern McHenry County prairie in 1883. 6 cords. The number mattered. A cord of wood is 128 cubic feet of stacked split timber, 4 feet wide, 4 feet tall, 8 feet long. 6 cords fills a small barn aisle to the ceiling. Cutting, splitting, and stacking, 6 cords of cottonwood by hand, crosscut saw for felling and bucking, splitting axe, wooden wedges. A maul required roughly 12 to 15 full days of hard physical labour, and that was assuming a healthy man doing the work. Heinz Blumenkrantz was 42 years old and not in poor health, but he also had the farm itself to run, and 12 days of pure woodcutting, taken out of the fall workload, was a significant cost that repeated every year without variation. If you could cut 3 cords instead of 6 and stay just as warm, those 9 days could go somewhere else. They could go to breaking more ground, mending fences, adding to a barn, cutting hay for a harder winter, expanding the garden. The fuel economy of a well-insulated structure was not an abstraction on the Dakota prairie. It was time, and time, for a widow alone on 160 acres, was not abstract either. Heinz Blumenkrantz came over in late October to offer condolences and, incidentally, to assess the situation of the young Norwegian widow on the adjacent claim. He was a practical man, not unkind. He looked at the dugout, looked at the stacked short logs, looked at Astrid sorting through a pile of sawdust she had asked for and received from the small mill operating out of Bottineau, and asked what she was building. She explained. In her careful English she had learned it in Quebec, and it was precise and slightly formal that she was going to build a stackwall house. She described the method. The short log ends set in mortar, the mortar with sawdust mixed in, the double mortar courses with a cavity filled with more sawdust between them. He asked why the sawdust in the middle. She said it was to trap the air. He looked at the sawdust pile and said trapping air was what chinking was for. She said chinking seals the outside air from getting in, and that is necessary. But what the sawdust did was different. It kept the air already inside the wall from moving. Moving air is not insulation, she told him. Still air is. The sawdust makes the air still. Heinz Blumenkrantz considered this for a moment. The concept was not entirely foreign to him. He had hung blankets over his frame cabin's interior walls to reduce drafts in the 2 previous winters, and blankets do the same thing at a crude level. They trap a layer of still air between the fabric and the wall face. But scaling that intuition up to the premise that you could build a wall whose entire internal structure was organized around trapping air, that was a step his experience did not prepare him to make. He told her it sounded like a lot of work for something that would likely fall apart in the first hard frost, that the cottonwood would crack and leave gaps, that she should do what every sensible settler did and build a proper frame structure, or at least a good sod house, and that his cousin in Minnewokan could sell her sawn lumber at a fair price. He meant it kindly. He was wrong about almost everything he said. She thanked him. She kept sorting sawdust. The mortar recipe she used was her father's formula, adapted for what was available in Dakota Territory. In Hallingdal, he had used a lime and sand base with a proportion of dried moss added to the inner cavity courses. In Dakota Territory, moss of the right kind was scarce, but the Bottineau mill produced more sawdust than it knew what to do with, and sawdust does the same job, traps air, adds modest insulating value of its own, and gives the mortar body without brittleness. Her proportions, worked out on paper before she mixed a single batch, 9 parts coarse river sand to 3 parts quicklime to 3 parts dry sawdust. She slaked the quicklime herself, which required careful work. Quicklime added to water generates significant heat and spatters if handled carelessly. She wore her dead husband's leather work gloves and worked in small batches, adding the quicklime to the water slowly, never the other direction. The foundation she built first, in November, using flat sandstone she quarried from an exposed seam along the lower drainage. 4 courses of dry-laid stone, no mortar, rising about 18 inches above grade enough to keep the wall bottoms above spring meltwater and isolate the log ends from direct contact with the soil. Sandstone is a poor conductor of heat relative to granite or limestone, and she chose it partly for that reason. Her father had explained, once, why he chose certain stones for foundations, not just for strength, but for what they did or did not do to the warmth of the floor above. She set the first wall courses in December, working in the cold. The mortar slowed in cold weather, but she had learned in Hallingdal that lime mortar cures not by freezing but by carbonation, carbon dioxide from the air converting the lime to calcium carbonate, and this process, slower in cold, still proceeded. She insulated newly laid courses overnight with old blankets and hay to prevent the fresh mortar from freezing hard before it had carbonated enough to have strength. The wall system, as she built it, 2 parallel mortar beads, each about 3 inches wide, laid with a gap of roughly 9 to 10 inches between them. The log ends went into the mortar with a firm press and a slight twist to seat them, spaced so no end grain touched another end grain, all mortar contact, no wood-to-wood contact. As the outer and inner mortar faces set, she packed the center cavity with the sawdust lime mixture, tamped lightly, then laid the next course. The wall grew slowly. She could add perhaps 14 inches of height per day before the fresh mortar below began taking weight it was not yet ready to bear. What she was building, without the language to describe it in these terms, was a composite thermal system that attacked the cold from 3 directions simultaneously. The outer mortar face absorbed wind pressure and kept outside air from entering the wall's interior. The inner mortar face held interior warmth against the wall surface, preventing drafts. Between them, the sawdust fill cavity trapped millions of pockets of still air, each pocket too small to circulate, which meant each pocket acted as a thermal break between the outer cold and the inner warmth. Remove any one of the 3 elements, and the system degrades. The outer mortar without the insulated cavity would give you a dense, cold wall. The insulated cavity without the sealed mortar faces would let wind infiltrate and destroy the still air effect. The inner mortar without the outer would give you a warm inner surface that conducts heat directly to the cold air outside. All 3 together gave you something closer to what modern building scientists call a perfect wall, a continuous thermal barrier with no thermal bridges. The corner joints she cut in a technique her father had called half dovetail, not the full Norwegian dovetail that required specialized axes and years of practice, but a simpler version that still locked the courses together against lateral movement. She had brought 2 augers from Norway, a 1-inch and a 2-inch. She used the 2-inch to bore drainage holes at the base of the outer mortar courses, low enough to let any moisture that penetrated from outside drain out rather than accumulate in the cavity. She worked 6 days a week from first light to last. Her hands, by mid-January, had a permanent coating of lime and sand ground into the skin that no amount of washing removed. The quicklime she slaked fresh for each day's mortar. The mix she measured not by weight but by volume, using a bent tin cup her father had made for mixing mortar still in the trunk from Norway, dented on one side from some long-ago accident she had never asked him about. She thought about him while she worked. She thought about his walls. She thought about the January morning she was 12 years old when she had stood inside the family house in Ål and pressed her palm flat against the interior wall surface while the wind came off the Hardangervidda at something her father said was 40 kilometers per hour, and the wall had been, against all childish expectation, warm. Not room temperature, warm, wall cold, the way all walls are cold in January. But not the biting, conducting cold of a stone wall in an old church. The right kind of cold, the insulated kind. She was making that wall in Dakota Territory, with cottonwood instead of pine and a tin cup instead of her father's clay bowl and lime sourced from the general store in Bottineau instead of the limestone her father quarried himself. The material was different. The principle was not. The roof was the element she debated longest. A proper sod roof would have been the most insulating option, but the wall plate arrangement for a sod roof required either very large rafters or very close spacing, and her available cottonwood was not ideal rafter material, too prone to checking and bending under sustained load. She built instead a steep-pitched board and batten roof, using lumber she traded 2 weeks of domestic work to obtain from the Torgerson claim. Gustav had a small stock of milled planking from a shipment the previous. Over the board roof she laid a double layer of tar paper, then a layer of prairie sod cut in 3-inch slabs and laid grass down, then another layer of tar paper, then a final layer of loose hay she secured with a grid of poles and wire. The composite roof had modest insulating value but shed snow efficiently due to the steep pitch, and the hay layer added dead air insulation above the tar paper. The finished structure was 16 feet by 20 feet inside. The walls were 20 inches thick on 3 sides and 24 inches thick on the north-facing wall, which bore the prevailing winter wind. The door faced south. Sheltered by a small projecting entry vestibule, a feature she built deliberately, after remembering that her father always said the worst thing you could do was open a door directly into a living space from the winter wind. You let cold in faster than any wall let it out. The vestibule added 6 square feet of floor area and approximately 3 seconds of time between the outside air and the interior. 3 seconds sounds meaningless. In a Dakota blizzard, 3 seconds is the difference between a door that swings open and closes again before the cold has fully entered the room, and a door that stands open while a person struggles against the wind pressure to close it, dumping 40 degrees Fahrenheit air directly onto the stove. Gustav Torgerson came to look at it when she was nearly finished, in late January 1884. He walked around it twice, knocked on the walls with his knuckles, peered in the door. He said it was the strangest house he had ever seen. He said it looked more like a root cellar than a house, with those short log ends sticking out of the mortar. He said it reminded him of something he had heard old men describe from Sweden, some old kind of building that nobody did anymore. He asked if she thought it would hold the cold out. She said she thought it would hold it out rather well. He said maybe so, and walked home. And that evening told his wife Birgit that the Norwegian widow on the Hagen claim had built herself the strangest cabin in McHenry County, and he would not like to be the one to tell her it might not work. But he had his doubts. The winter of 1884 was her first full test. McHenry County does not have gentle winters. January of 1884 brought 3 separate cold snaps. The first dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 days, the second to 31 degrees Fahrenheit, and the third, the last week of January, held at 28 degrees Fahrenheit for 6 consecutive days, with northwest winds measured by Gustav Torgerson's improvised anemometer at what he estimated was 30 to 40 miles per hour. Astrid Hagen burned 2 cords of cottonwood that January. She burned a 3rd cord across all of February and March combined. Heinz Blumenkrantz burned through his 6-cord supply by the first week of March and bought 2 additional cords from a supplier in Bottineau for $4.50, each $9 he had not budgeted. The difference was not magical. It was arithmetic applied to physics. Blumenkrantz's frame cabin, with standard chinking and a single layer of sawn lumber on the walls, had an effective R value of perhaps R4 to R6 under wind load. The framing members conducted heat from the warm interior face directly through the stud to the cold exterior, and the chinking, no matter how carefully applied, had microscopic gaps that wind infiltrated and exploited. At 28 degrees Fahrenheit outside with 35 mile-per-hour winds, maintaining 55 degrees Fahrenheit inside a frame cabin required continuous heat input. The stove ran hot. The fuel supply bled down. Astrid's 20-inch cordwood wall, with its sealed sawdust cavity, performed at roughly R20 to R25 under the same conditions, and the mortar faces, unlike chinking, did not flex and gap under wind pressure. The wall held its seal. The dead air in the cavity stayed dead. The temperature gradient from inside to outside spread slowly and evenly across 20 inches of combined wood, mortar, and trapped air rather than cutting sharply through 6 inches of framing and single-layer lumber. She ran her stove at half the rate. The fuel lasted. He came to Astrid's door in early March, ostensibly to see how she had fared the winter, and she offered him tea, and he sat in the cabin and noticed that it was, in his honest assessment, warmer than his own frame cabin. He sat near the stove, which was burning at a low, steady rate, and he noticed the absence of the draughts that plagued his own structure, the cold seeping in at the window frames, along the baseboard, through the chinking gaps in the corners. The walls were not draughty. They were solid in a way that frame walls, no matter how carefully built, simply were not. He asked her how much wood she had burned. She told him. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the words she would remember. Huh. He did not say she had been right. He did not say he had been wrong. He said, huh, and drank his tea, and walked home, and Astrid Hagen thought, good enough. She planted in the spring of 1884. She proved up her homestead claim 5 years of residency required, and she made all 5, working the land alone and hiring a neighbour's teenage son for the heaviest plough work during planting and harvest seasons. She added a small barn in 1886, also stackwall construction, also cottonwood ends in sawdust lime mortar. She dug a root cellar that same year, going down 8 feet well below the frost line to keep potatoes, turnips, and preserved foods through even the worst winters. The root cellar was not an afterthought. The frost line in McHenry County can penetrate 4 to 6 feet in an ordinary winter and potentially deeper in a severe one. Most settlers dug their root cellars to 3 or 4 feet, which was adequate for normal years but left their food stores vulnerable in extreme cold. At 8 feet, the cellar floor sat in earth that maintained a relatively constant temperature year-round, approximately 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, fed by the slow, deep thermal mass of the earth itself. A potato stored at 45 degrees Fahrenheit does not freeze. A turnip at 45 degrees Fahrenheit does not rot from cold damage. The 8-foot depth was not excessive caution. It was the margin between losing your food supply and keeping it. She had seen what losing your food supply looked like. In the long winter of 1880-81, settlers across Dakota Territory had run out of coal, wood, and flour simultaneously when blizzards shut the Northern Pacific Railroad from October through May. The De Smet settlers, which included the Ingalls family, twisted hay and slough grass into sticks to burn a constant, exhausting labor that produced perhaps 20 minutes of heat per bundle. By that winter, a firewood supply question and a food cellar question were the same question. How deep did you plan, and how honestly did you think about what the worst looked like? In the summer of 1887, she remarked to Birgit Blumenkrantz, while the two women were churning butter on the Blumenkrantz porch, that the animals had been behaving strangely since late June. The meadowlarks were moving south earlier than usual. The mice had come into the barn in August, which was 2 months ahead of their normal timing. The cattle were eating more than the season warranted, building fat in a way that did not match the available forage. Birgit said she hadn't noticed. Astrid said her father had taught her to watch these things. In Hallingdal, when the animals started behaving out of season, it meant the winter was going to be harder than normal. She had been watching since June, and what she was seeing concerned her. Birgit said that was an old country superstition, probably. Astrid said maybe, and went home and spent the rest of August and all of September cutting twice as much firewood as she thought she would need. Adding 3 more logs to the north wall cavity, she had found gaps in the mortar during the summer inspection and repointed them, and building a second layer of the insulating earthen berm she had piled against the north and west exterior walls. She also dug into the base of the south-facing wall, where the original foundation was, and reset 2 stone courses that had heaved slightly from frost action over 3 winters. She was doing this resetting the foundation stones when a man from town named Ansel Gruber rode past on the main track and stopped to watch. Ansel Gruber was a land speculator from Bismarck who had been buying up failed homestead claims at distress prices and was now, in the fall of 1887, interested in whether the Hagen claim might come available. He had made discreet inquiries. He had been told the Norwegian widow was managing but struggling, which was what he told himself about all the claims he targeted. He watched her work for a moment and said she was wasting her time resetting foundation stones in October when she should be buying more fuel and laying in food supplies for winter. He said, quite openly, that the cabin looked like it would be cold, all those little short logs. They don't hold heat like proper construction. He said he happened to know a widow east of Minot who had tried a similar thing and nearly froze in her second winter and had sold him the claim by March. Astrid kept resetting stones. She said, without looking up, that the widow east of Minot must have used green wood and mixed her mortar wrong. Ansel Gruber said, well, be that as it may, the offer stood if things got difficult this winter. She did not answer. He rode on. What she did next, in October 1887, is the thing Erling Solberg would not fully understand until he had pulled out 2 full sections of the south wall and spread the contents across the floor of the cabin in the spring of 1961. She mixed a special batch of mortar slightly richer in lime than the wall mix, slightly finer in texture, and she took 3 objects, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, and set them into the mortar cavity between the outer and inner courses of the south wall, at approximately shoulder height, below the level of the single south-facing window. She packed the cavity back with sawdust lime fill, smoothed the mortar faces, and let it cure. Then she rebuilt the earthen berm against the north exterior wall to a depth of 18 inches, using sod cut from the far side of the garden plot where the soil was dense with root mat and would not slump in rain. She banked the berm firmly against the stone foundation courses and the first 3 feet of wall, angling it away from the structure at a 30-degree slope so that snowfall would slide off rather than accumulate in a wedge against the wall. Against the west wall she built a simpler version of the same berm, 6 inches deep, enough to seal the base against wind infiltration. By the end of October 1887, the cabin had 20-inch cordwood walls on 3 sides, a 24-inch wall on the north, an 18-inch earthen berm against the north wall extending up 3 feet, a 6-inch berm against the west wall, a double insulated roof, a south-facing door behind a small vestibule, a root cellar 8 feet deep with 8 bushels of potatoes, 4 bushels of turnips, smoked and salted pork from 2 hogs, pickled cabbage, dried beans, and enough firewood stacked inside the vestibule and in the barn for 12 weeks of hard winter. She had read the animals right. The 12th of January, 1888, began at 4 a.m. with temperatures in the low 40s degrees Fahrenheit across Dakota Territory. It was warm enough that some settlers sent children to school without winter wraps. It was warm enough that teachers opened school windows to let in fresh air. Gustaf Torgerson's wife Birgit later said she had been washing clothes that morning and thinking it was almost pleasant. The front formed out of Alberta, a mass of Arctic air that had been building for weeks, held back by an unusual pressure pattern, and then released. It crossed the Medicine Hat Plateau and struck the Dakota Territory prairies at midday on January 12 at a speed that left no time for any warning system of the era to respond. The U.S. Signal Corps, which managed weather forecasting, had issued no warning. In Washington, the forecaster on duty that day logged the front's approach, but underestimated its speed by several hours. In Huron, Dakota Territory, the temperature was in the mid-40s degrees Fahrenheit at noon. By 2 p.m., it was 20 degrees Fahrenheit. By 6 p.m., it was 10 degrees Fahrenheit. By midnight, it was 27 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind came with the cold, not a gradual pickup, but a wall of wind, sustained at 50 to 60 miles per hour, driving fine, dry snow that felt like ground glass against skin and reduced visibility to less than 3 feet within minutes of its arrival. 3 minutes. Survivors across Dakota Territory and Nebraska reported a drop of 18 degrees Fahrenheit in 3 minutes, which is not a figure anyone had to measure carefully to believe they felt it. Instantly, the warmth vanishing and something murderous replacing it. Across McHenry County, families that had been going about their midday work had between 2 minutes and no time at all to get inside. Children at the county's scattered rural schoolhouses were either sheltered by teachers with the sense to keep them in place and burn every stick of available fuel, or were sent home, and those who were sent home, in the storm's first disorienting minutes, walked into a whiteout they could not navigate. The distance between a schoolhouse and a farm might be a quarter mile. In a Dakota Territory January whiteout at 20 degrees Fahrenheit wind chill, a quarter mile might as well be 20 miles if you cannot tell which direction you are walking. The McHenry County losses in the 1888 blizzard were part of the broader regional catastrophe. The final documented death toll across the affected states, Dakota Territory, Nebraska, Minnesota, and parts of Iowa, Kansas, and Montana, ran between 235 and 500. Children made up an estimated 213 of the dead. Most died not from the cold alone, but from the combination of disorientation and wind chill. They left shelter confident they knew the direction home, took 3 wrong turns in the whiteout, and were found 30 to 400 yards from where they had started, frozen. The cold itself was extraordinary, the documented low at Poplar River. Montana was 56.8 degrees Fahrenheit. With wind, the National Weather Service's Black Hills office later noted that even in the Black Hills, partially sheltered by mountains, temperatures reached 36 degrees Fahrenheit at lead. The open prairies had no such protection. The schoolteacher accounts from that day are among the most documented survivor stories in Great Plains history. Minnie Mae Freeman, 19 years old, taught at a sod schoolhouse near Ord, Nebraska. When the storm tore the door off its leather hinges and then tore away the tar paper roof, she grabbed a ball of twine she had confiscated that morning from a student named Frankie Gibbon, tied her 13 students together in a line, and led them half a mile through zero visibility wind to her boarding house. All 13 survived. She received more than 80 marriage proposals by mail in the following weeks, a gold medal from the Nebraska State Education Board, and was immortalized in a song published by Leon and Healy of Chicago. The Nebraska State Capitol installed a glass mosaic in her honor in 1967. Lois Royce faced a different outcome. Her school in Plainview, Nebraska ran out of fuel by 3 p.m., and the boarding house where she lived stood only 82 yards away. She tried to lead 3 students to it, 2 boys of 9 and a 6-year-old girl named Hattie Rosberg. They became lost in the whiteout within 30 yards of the school. All 3 children froze to death. Lois Royce survived but lost both feet to amputation. She eventually learned to walk on artificial limbs and went on to teach again. Etta Shattuck, 19, was caught between buildings in Holt County, Nebraska. She found a haystack and burrowed into it with frozen, bare hands. She stayed alive inside that haystack for 78 hours, more than 3 days, without food or water, until Farmer Daniel D. Murphy heard her voice while shoveling snow. Both legs were amputated. She died on the 6th of February, 1888, from post-surgical infection, less than 4 weeks after the storm. The structure performance data embedded in survivor accounts is specific and consistent. Sod houses and earthen structures held warmth better than frame buildings. Kate Campen, 19 years old, had given birth to her first son 4 days before the blizzard hit, alone in a sod house in Marion, Dakota Territory. When the storm arrived, her husband was 23 miles away in Parker buying coal. His horses suffocated in the wind. He spent 3 nights in a pig barn. Kate stayed in bed in the sod house with the newborn for 3 days until he returned. Both survived. The thick earthen walls of the sod house buffered the temperature differential across their mass in a way that frame walls simply could not. Noah later cited poor construction as a contributing factor in blizzard deaths. The pioneer boom had outpaced building quality, producing schoolhouses with limited fuel, single doors that blew open under wind pressure, and thin walls that provided no thermal buffer once the interior fire exhausted its fuel. The Black Hills towns were relatively protected by surrounding terrain. The National Weather Service reports no lives lost in the Black Hills area despite lead recording, 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The open prairies, treeless, with no topographic shelter, bore the full kinetic and thermal force of a front, moving at 45 miles per hour. Astrid Hagen was splitting wood in the vestibule when the front arrived. She knew what it was the moment the temperature changed, not the gradual chilling of a normal storm's approach, but a different quality to the air, sharp and somehow pressurized, like the moment before a thunderstorm, only in reverse. Instead of a gathering electrical charge, a sudden electrical absence, as if the warmth had been switched off. She pulled the inner vestibule door shut first, then the outer door, dropped the wooden bar into its bracket, and went to check the stove. She put 3 cottonwood sections on the fire, not 6, not 8, 3. Her father's rule: in a properly built wall, the fire is not the last line of defense, it is an auxiliary. The wall does the work, the fire keeps the wall's work from being undone. She set the stovepipe damper to reduce the draw, not increase it, a counterintuitive move that a cold person's instinct would always fight, because when you are cold you want the fire to roar. But a roaring fire in a too drafty stove pulls cold air in through every crack and gap as it sucks oxygen through the room. A moderated fire in a tight structure actually heats better because it loses less warmth to infiltration. Then she checked the door seals, checked the window seal on the single south-facing window, checked the vestibule door seal, and waited. The wind hit the north wall of the cabin, at what survivors in the county estimated was 55 to 60 miles per hour. It ran along the north wall first, found the earthen berm, ran over it, and continued. The berm deflected the initial ground-level blast away from the wall base, not perfectly, but significantly. Wind at ground level in a Dakota blizzard is not just wind. It is wind carrying an abrasive load of ice crystals traveling at speed, and it finds every gap in a structure at ground level before it finds the gaps higher up. The berm's job was to keep the lowest 2 feet of wall in dead air shadow while the rest took the wind head-on. The cordwood wall took the wind head-on. Inside the south wall, the wall Astrid had repointed in September, the wall she had embedded the oilcloth-wrapped objects in October. The temperature differential between the interior face and the exterior face was, at the peak of the storm, approximately 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, 40 degrees Fahrenheit with wind. Inside the room, 45 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained by the low, steady fire. The wall's 2-foot thickness and R value of approximately 25 to 304, 20-inch cottonwood cordwood with sawdust lime cavity fill, mediated this 85-degree gradient smoothly. Not a sudden conductance, but a slow gradient from warm to cold across 2 feet of wood ends and trapped air. She did not sweat. She did not add extra wood. She read. She owned 7 books, all in Norwegian, brought from Ole in a trunk that had survived the Atlantic crossing and the rail transfer at Quebec, and the wagon haul from Minot, a Bible, 2 volumes of Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson's rural stories, a surveying manual that had been Carl's, a cookbook from Bergen, a small book on Norwegian medicinal plants that her mother had given her, and a journal in which she wrote with the frugality of someone who understood that paper, in Dakota Territory, was a premium material. She lit the lamp at 3 p.m., when the storm darkened the sky completely. She fed the horses from the interior door that connected the cabin to the small barn, another feature she had built that most settlers had not, and one that Heinz Blumenkrantz had noted with disapproval as being unsanitary, to which she had replied that the horses' body heat was free, and she did not intend to waste it. Each horse generated roughly 1,000 to 2,500 BTUs per hour at rest. 2 horses, across a connected structure with a shared wall, contributed perhaps 2,000 BTUs per hour to the total thermal load of the barn cabin system. Not trivial. A modest wood stove, in a well-insulated 320 square foot space, might generate 8,000 to 12,000 BTUs per hour. The horses were adding the equivalent of running a second, small stove at no cost. She fed the horses and came back to her chair. At 6 p.m. she added 2 more cottonwood sections to the fire. The interior temperature had held at about 44 degrees Fahrenheit, not warm but survivable, and well above the temperature at which water pipes, had she had any, would freeze, and well above the temperature at which the potatoes in the root cellar, 8 feet down, were in any danger. At 8 p.m. she heard something at the vestibule door. Not the storm was a continuous roar against the north wall, as steady and impersonal as a river. This was different, intermittent. She listened for 3 minutes. It came again, an impact against the outer vestibule door, irregular, not the rhythm of a wind gust. She put on her father's wool coat and her husband's sheepskin overshirt and opened the inner door into the vestibule. She pressed her ear to the outer door and listened, heard it again. She cracked the outer door against the wind pressure it required both hands, and in the gap she saw, faintly in the darkness, a shape. It was a child, a boy, perhaps 12 years old, who had left a farm a mile north of the Hagen claim to find his cattle in a pasture shelter, and had misjudged the direction of home in the first minutes of the whiteout and had walked south instead of north. He had found the Hagen cabin's vestibule. An earthen berm creates a small pocket of compressed air on its leeward side, and in a whiteout this slight slowing of the wind and the differential warmth of earth-sheltered wall can be detectable by a person desperate enough to notice it. He had pressed himself against the vestibule wall and found the door in the dark. She pulled him inside. His name was Edvard Torgersen, Gustaf's youngest. Both hands had frostbite white, waxy, with no feeling. His face was wind-burned to a deep red that would blister in the morning. He was beyond shivering, which was the concerning thing. The body stops shivering at a certain stage of hypothermia, trading the metabolic cost of shivering for a dangerous, deceptive warmth. She put him on the floor near the stove and covered him with the 2 wool blankets from her bed. She did not put him close to the stove, and she did not rub his hands. Rewarming frost-bitten tissue quickly causes tissue death. She had seen this once in Hallingdal when a child fell through ice and a well-meaning neighbour held his feet directly in front of a fire. The feet had to come off at the ankle. She warmed Edvard Torgersen slowly, with her body heat and the wool blankets and the 4-degree air of the cabin, and she gave him hot water with a small amount of lard stirred in for caloric density, and at 4 inches the morning she looked at his hands and thought he would keep most of his fingers. He slept. She did not. She added wood to the fire at 10 p.m., and again at 2 a.m., and again at 5 a.m., which was when the wind changed direction slightly and she could hear it shifting from the northwest to the north-northwest, which her father had told her was the sign that a storm's worst was past. that the front's leading edge had moved south of you, and you were now in the diminishing backside of it. She went to the window and scraped a circle in the frost on the interior glass. There was frost on the inside of the window, which told her the interior temperature had dropped to approximately 32 degrees Fahrenheit near the glass surface, though it was warmer near the floor and stove and looked out into darkness. Nothing visible. At 7 a.m. on January 13, the temperature outside was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind had dropped to 20 miles per hour. The sky was clearing. Astrid Hagen opened the vestibule outer door, looked at the drift that had built against the north and west walls. It reached to the roofline on the north side, a wall of packed snow 8 feet high, forming an accidental second layer of insulation over her intentional earthen berm, and went back inside. The interior temperature was 40 degrees Fahrenheit. She had burned during the 18 hours of the blizzard's worst fury, and the night that followed, approximately 3/4 of a cord of wood. Gustaf Torgersen came for Edvard 3 days later, when the temperature had risen enough to make travel possible. He came on horseback, having lost 2 cattle to the storm found frozen upright in their pasture shelter, the structure too open on the east side to deflect the wind load. He came to the Hagen cabin expecting to find either Edvard dead or evidence that Astrid had somehow found him and pulled him to the Blumenkrantz place, which was sturdier than it looked. He was not expecting to find his son sitting at the cabin table, eating salt, pork, and rye bread, and apparently in reasonable health, with 2 hands bandaged in strips of linen with a salve Astrid had prepared from the Norwegian medicinal plant book. He sat down across from his son and looked at his hands, and then looked around the cabin. He looked at the walls. He rapped his knuckle against the wall next to the door, a thing all men did in that era when assessing a structure, the same instinct that makes you tap a watermelon in a store, and noted the dull, dense sound of it, nothing like the hollow resonance of a frame wall. He asked her, "How cold did it get in here?" She said about 40 degrees at its lowest. He said his own house had gone to 22 degrees Fahrenheit. He had measured it on the thermometer he kept indoors. His wife and daughter had been fine, layered in every garment they owned, feeding the stove constantly, but they had burned through 5 days of wood supply in 18 hours because the wind was finding every gap in the frame walls. He had chased drafts with rags and old newspaper, and the gaps kept appearing. The frame had racked slightly under the wind load, opening joints that had been tight the week before. That last detail, the frame racking, is worth staying with for a moment, because it is the key to what Torgersen could feel in Astrid's wall but could not yet articulate. A frame wall is a load-bearing assembly. Wooden plates, studs, joists, all nailed or pegged together at joints. Under extreme wind load, the joints flex. The frame moves microscopically, nothing visible to the eye, but enough to open the interface between stud and plate, between chinking material and log, between window frame and rough opening. Each of those interface movements creates a path for infiltration, and infiltration is the death of insulation. Cordwood mortar walls do not work this way. The mortar is not a joint, it is a continuous, rigid matrix. Every log end is embedded in it, bonded to it on 2 faces. The wall section does not have joints to flex because it is not an assembly of discrete framed members. It is a monolith, dense, continuous, structurally more similar to masonry than to carpentry. Under the same wind load that caused Torgersen's frame to rack, Astrid's cordwood wall absorbed the lateral pressure without deflection. The mortar cracked under extreme seismic or impact loading, but horizontal wind pressure on a properly bonded cordwood wall produces no movement detectable to a human hand on the interior face. Gustaf Torgersen looked at the cordwood walls of the Hagen cabin for a long time. Then he said something that Edvard, now an old man being interviewed by David Laskin's research contacts in the early 2000s, still remembered. "Your walls don't move." Those 4 words contained, in the compressed form of a practical man's observation, everything that the physics of the previous 4 years had been trying to demonstrate. The walls don't move. The mortar doesn't gap. The dead air stays still. The R value holds under load. The temperature inside does not track the temperature outside. 3 days after Torgerson's visit, Heinz Blumenkrantz came to the Hagen cabin with Marta, who brought a small crock of pickled cucumber as what Astrid later described in her journal as a peace offering, though he did not frame it that way. Heinz walked the exterior of the cabin slowly, looking at the earthen berms, the vestibule, the angle of the structure relative to the prevailing wind direction, the steep pitch of the roof that had shed its snow load rather than bearing it. He said, to nobody in particular, that the angle of the building puzzled him. It was not square to the cardinal directions the way every other settler's cabin in the county was built. It was rotated perhaps 15 degrees clockwise from true north-south orientation. Astrid told him, the door faces south to catch winter sun. The north wall faces the prevailing wind directly, so the berm runs parallel to it. The structure is angled to put both the solar collection and the wind deflection at their maximum efficiency simultaneously. True south is 15 degrees off what compass north says in McHenry County, because magnetic declination in that part of Dakota Territory is approximately 8 degrees east of true north. She had adjusted for it using a calculation her husband's surveying manual described. A door that appears to face south on a compass actually faces 15 degrees east of true south in this location, which means it receives maximum winter solar exposure in the morning, but loses it in the afternoon. Her door faced true south, not magnetic south. Heinz Blumenkrantz looked at the door and then at the angle of the low January sun and then back at the door and said nothing. Marta opened the crock of pickled cucumber and set it on the table. They stayed for 2 hours. When they left, Heinz asked Astrid to write down the mortar proportions for the sawdust-lime mix. This is the thing about dead air that most people then and now do not fully absorb. The insulation you can trust is the insulation that cannot change. Frame walls have a fixed insulating value when they are perfectly tight, but frame walls are never perfectly tight for long. They move. Wood expands and contracts with temperature and moisture. Nails loosen. Joints open. Wind finds the gap. Every time a gap opens, the dead air that was doing the insulating escapes, and outside air, moving air, takes its place, and the R value of that section of wall drops towards 0. Cordwood mortar walls do not move in the same way. The mortar locks the wood ends in place. The cavity between the mortar courses is sealed. Dead air trapped in sawdust fill between sealed mortar faces cannot circulate, cannot be replaced by outside air, cannot lose its insulating value in a wind event. What you built is what you have, and a blizzard at 60 miles per hour does not change it. This is also why the storm performance of different structures on the 12th of January 1888 diverged so sharply from their apparent quality. A well-built Norwegian-style sod house, dense, continuous, no joints to open, held up. A well-built cordwood house held up. A frame house, even a carefully built one, was only as good as its weakest joint on the night the wind found it. And on the 12th of January 1888, the wind found all of them. Heinz Blumenkrantz's frame cabin went to 19 degrees Fahrenheit interior temperature and lost its east-facing window. The wind pressure was enough to flex the frame wall and unseat the window from its rough-cut opening, and the glass cracked along the bottom rail. He covered it with a blanket and burned furniture. Marta Blumenkrantz burned a maple rocking chair that had come from her mother's house in Wisconsin, and a small table that had been a wedding gift, and 3 wooden tool handles. By the time the storm broke, she had burned 8 cords of wood equivalent, and the wall studs were still cold to the touch. 3 farms north of Bottineau, a bachelor homesteader named Werner Schell was found 3 weeks after the storm, frozen in his frame cabin. He had run out of firewood on the second night of the storm and had not had the mass of wall between him and the cold that a cordwood or sod structure would have provided. The thermometer in his cabin read 12 degrees Fahrenheit when the neighbors broke down the door. A frame wall with standard chinking in 1888 Dakota Territory had an effective R value, accounting for air infiltration and thermal bridging through the wooden studs, of perhaps R3 to R6. At a sustained exterior temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that wall cannot maintain interior warmth without a continuous, substantial fuel supply. When the fuel ran out, the wall provided no buffer. Astrid Hagen's wall was still holding 40 degrees Fahrenheit on the morning of the second day after the storm, with no fire burning. She filed for title on the claim in March of 1888, 5 years and 5 months after Carl's death. The Land Office record for McHenry County shows her as the holder of record for Section 14, Township 160 North, Range 78 West, 160 acres, proved up, title clear. The record is dry and administrative but represents one of the most difficult things a single woman could accomplish in Dakota Territory. In that era, 5 years of continuous improvement on a claim, with no husband, no hired man, no family help, and a legal system that gave her a homestead right, but no dower right to anything that was not titled in her name. The legal situation of frontier widows was intricate in ways that most people today do not appreciate, and it mattered directly to what Astrid Hagen built and what she hid inside it. Under the English common law doctrine of dower, which remained operative in Dakota Territory through both the 1,877 and 1,887 territorial codes, a widow was entitled to a life interest in 1/3 of the income from her husband's real property, not ownership a life interest. She could not sell it, will it, mortgage it, or pass it to her children. She held it for the duration of her life, and when she died, the underlying property reverted to her husband's heirs, which could include brothers, cousins, in-laws. In parallel, the doctrine of coverture held that a married woman's legal identity was subsumed in her husband's. She could not sue, could not contract, could not hold property in her own name during marriage without specific legislative exceptions. Dakota Territory had made modest reforms. The 1,877 code permitted married women to own separate property and enter contracts related to their own trade or business. But the reforms stopped well short of equal standing. A widow without a clear title deed in her own name was legally exposed to claims from her husband's family, and the only way to close that exposure was the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act of 1862, its language, specifically is where Astrid Hagen's legal situation and her building choices intersect. The Act's text read, "Any person who is the head of a family, or who has arrived at the age of 21 years. Section 2 used the phrase, he or she. Congress had, in 1862, explicitly included women as eligible homestead claimants, not as wives or appendages, but as persons in their own right, heads of their own households, entitled to claim and title 160 acres of federal land. A widow who filed a homestead claim and proved it up received a fee simple title, absolute ownership, not a life interest, held in her own name, defensible against any in-law or creditor's claim. This is why Astrid Hagen spent 5 years on 160 acres of Dakota Territory prairie alone. She was not staying because she had nowhere to go. She was staying because staying was how you closed the legal gap. The title she received in March 1888 was a document that said, in the language of American federal law, that this land was hers not 1/3 of its income for her lifetime, but the land itself, free and clear. She had put the letters from her sister documents that recorded what family land had existed in Norway and the deed that showed what had been taken from her when her brother inherited the Hallingdal farm into the wall that she had built to hold what she could not afford to lose. The legal documents of loss, sealed in the most durable structure she knew how to make, inside a wall built with the same knowledge that had been passed to the brother who got the land instead of her. She married again in 1891, a widower named Olaf Hagen, no relation to Carl, from Langdon, who had come to McHenry County to look for land and had heard about the Norwegian woman in the valley outside Bottineau, whose unusual cabin had held 40 degrees Fahrenheit through the worst blizzard in territorial history. He moved into the cabin. He put his name on nothing. She had seen to that arrangement before the wedding, and he, being a practical man, agreed. They had 2 children, both boys, Christopher, born 1892, and Peder, born 1895. Astrid died in 1931, age 82, of a stroke, in the same cabin she had built alone in the winter of 1883, 1884. Olaf had died in 1917. Christopher and Peder both left the valley, Christopher to Minot, where he worked in a hardware store, Peder to Seattle, and the cabin passed to Christopher's children and then to his grandchildren, none of whom had ever spent a winter on the McHenry County prairie. They sold it to Erling Solberg in 1961 for $50. Solberg was, by all accounts, a careful and patient man. He did not tear the south wall apart in a day. He worked section by section, removing 1 course of mortar at a time with a wide chisel, documenting what he found with a camera his daughter had given him for Christmas. The bottles, he found first 7 of them, dark glass, no markings, set into the mortar at various heights and angles, their end-grain faces visible from outside, appearing to be simply part of the wall, but their bottle bodies extending into the cavity, catching whatever light came through the mortar cracks at the right season and angle, sending faint arcs of colour across the interior wall. This was a known practice in cordwood construction called bottle glass art by modern builders, where the builder presses coloured bottles neck first into the wall cavity and surrounds them with mortar so the bottle bottom faces outside and the bottle body extends inward, creating a stained glass effect when sunlight strikes them at low winter angles. Astrid had used clear bottles, not coloured ones. The effect would have been subtle, a bead of light moving across the wall in late afternoon, but the placement was deliberate, at window height, positioned to throw light toward the reading chair she had sat in for 47 winters. Solberg understood the bottles immediately. He had seen photographs of cordwood buildings with glass bottle inserts. He photographed each one in place before removing the surrounding mortar, noted its position relative to the window height, measured the cavity depth with a folded paper card. He was methodical. He thought he understood what he was looking at. Then he found the oilcloth. It was in the 3rd section of the south wall he opened, at approximately shoulder height, just below the window sill on the interior face. The mortar on either side of it was fractionally different in colour from the surrounding wall, slightly lighter, indicating a somewhat richer lime content. She had mixed a finer batch for this section. Under magnification, Solberg had a hand lens in his tool bag. The lime crystals in the mortar around the oilcloth appeared more uniformly crystallized than the bulk wall mortar, consistent with a slower curing mix that had been protected from temperature fluctuation during setting. She had been careful about this one spot in a way she had not been careful elsewhere. The oilcloth itself was still largely intact. Lime mortar is strongly alkaline. The pH of fully cured lime mortar runs around 11 to 12, close to household bleach in alkalinity. This high pH creates a hostile environment for the bacteria and fungi that decompose organic material, which is why archaeological finds encased in lime mortar are often remarkably well preserved. The oilcloth's organic content had partially degraded, but the wax coating that gives oilcloth its waterproofing had polymerized and hardened around the contents like a crude shellac. creating a secondary seal inside the mortar's alkaline protection. He unwrapped it outside, in the April sun, on the overturned bucket that had become his workstation. The sawdust from the cavity fill fell off the oilcloth in small, chalky crumbles, still lime-white, still dry after 74 years inside the wall. He peeled the cloth back slowly. Inside, the 3 items, the letters in Norwegian, water-stained around the edges from some long-ago condensation event, but readable at the centre of each page. The deed from Hallingdal, a formal Norwegian land document in the style of the 1870s, names written in copper-plate script, the annotation in the margin in a lawyer's hand, and the small book, the Norwegian medicinal plant volume her mother had given her before she left for Quebec, which had saved Edvard Torgerson's hands on the night of the 12th of January 1888. Solberg sat with those 3 items for a long time. He was a man who had spent his working life delivering mail letters from families to other families, documents that travelled across distances and carried the weight of things people could not say in person. He had a retired postal worker's understanding of what it meant to entrust something to a container. You sealed it because you needed it to arrive intact. You addressed it to the future. You did not know who would receive it or when. You sealed it and sent it and hoped. She had sealed it into lime mortar at shoulder height in a south-facing wall in October 1887. She had addressed it to no one. It had arrived in 1,961 inches, the hands of a man who had paid $50 for the house and found, inside the thing he'd bought, the record of the life that had built it. There is a direct line from Astrid Hagen's wall to the buildings going up in Vermont and Wisconsin and British Columbia today. Cordwood construction never entirely disappeared in the Great Lakes region, and the Canadian Shield, the University of Manitoba's R35 test, used a wall design descended directly from the practice Astrid had brought from Hallingdal. Rob Roy's Earthwood Building School, operating since the 1980s near Plattsburgh, New York, has trained more than 1,000 people in the technique. Modern cordwood walls use the same sawdust lime cavity fill Astrid mixed in the fall of 1883, sometimes supplemented with perlite or cellulose for higher R values. The double mortar course system she used outer bead, inner bead, insulated cavity is the standard modern method. The 2004 University of Manitoba study found that a 4-inch modern cordwood wall with a sawdust lime center cavity achieved an R value of 35. A standard modern home with a 2x6 stud wall and fiberglass insulation achieves R19 to R22. The passive house movement, which began in Germany in the late 1980s and has spread across North America, uses thick, continuous insulation to achieve exactly the thermal consistency that Astrid's wall provided, not just high R value, but elimination of thermal bridging the paths through which heat escapes around, rather than through the insulation. In a frame wall, the wooden studs themselves are thermal bridges, conducting heat from the warm interior to the cold exterior far faster than the insulation between them. In a cordwood wall, the mortar is a modest thermal bridge, but the geometry short log ends embedded in mortar on both sides, with a sealed insulated cavity between distributes and minimizes the bridging effect in a way that frame construction does not. This is why the wall does not move. Not in a blizzard, and not structurally. The University of Manitoba testing also subjected cordwood wall sections to compressive and wind loading. A properly built cordwood wall with lime mortar can carry significant structural loads. Rob Roy documents walls in his homes that have carried snow loads of over 200 pounds per square foot on roofs supported by cordwood walls. Without visible distress to the mortar joints after 20+ years, the lime mortar continues to carbonate slowly for decades, actually gaining strength over time rather than degrading the opposite of Portland cement, which reaches peak strength in 28 days and then slowly weakens. Astrid Hagen's walls, tested by the 12th of January 1888 storm that killed at least 235 people across the same region, had performed exactly as her father's walls had performed in Hallingdal. They had done what a wall is supposed to do: stand between the person inside and the forces outside, and not move. Erling Solberg did not sell what he found in the wall. He was not that kind of man. He contacted the McHenry County Historical Society in Bottineau, which put him in touch with the Norwegian American Museum at Vesterheim in Dakota, Iowa, which at that time was in the process of documenting exactly the kind of building tradition Astrid had practiced. The letters went to Vesterheim's archive. The land deed and the medicinal plant book went to the State Historical Society of North Dakota in Bismarck. He repaired the wall he had opened. He used a lime sand mortar, not the modern Portland cement that most repair contractors would have used, because he had understood, by that point, that Portland cement is too rigid, it cracks under the freeze-thaw movement that lime absorbs with small elastic deformation. He packed the cavity with dry sawdust. He did not find any more oilcloth packages, but he did not look particularly hard. He had the feeling that whatever else Astrid had sealed into those walls, she had put it there with some intention that he was not entitled to overturn. He used the cabin as a storage shed for 4 years. Then he deeded it to the McHenry County Historical Society in 1965, free of charge, with a note attached that said the building was a 1,884 Norwegian-American cordwood structure, the oldest documented example of stackwall construction in North Dakota, and that it had been built by a woman named Astrid Hagen, widow, who had survived the Schoolhouse Blizzard of January 12, 1,888 inside it. The Historical Society put a small marker on it and left it standing. Here is the thing about what Astrid Hagen understood that the people around her did not. She did not understand it abstractly. She understood it physically, in the same way that her father understood it not as a formula or a calculation, but as a practice, a set of decisions that accumulated into a fact. The wall keeps the warmth in. The specific decisions were: dry the wood before you use it, use a double mortar course, fill the cavity with material that traps air without allowing it to move, set the log's end grain out, because end grain accepts mortar contact better than side grain, and because end grain is where the wood's natural radial and tangential cells are exposed, creating a surface that bonds more completely with lime mortar. Build the north wall thicker than the south wall. Bank earth against the base on the prevailing wind side. Put the door in the south-facing wall. Build a vestibule so you do not open your living space directly to the storm. Every one of these decisions is defensible in the physics. Together, they constitute a thermal management system that performs measurably better than the standard construction of its era and, in certain comparisons, measurably better than the standard construction of ours. But the physics is only the second part of the story. The first part is the woman who understood it when none of the people around her did, and who kept building it the way she had been taught, even when a man named Heinz Blumenkrantz told her it would fail, and a speculator named Ansel Gruber stopped to inform her she was wasting her time. She did not argue with them. She did not explain herself. She mixed the mortar and laid the log ends and packed the cavity and set the door in the south wall and built the vestibule and the earthen berm and the second berm and the connected barn door, because she understood that on the 12th of January 1888, or whatever night the test came, the wall would either hold or it would not, and explanations given to skeptics before the storm were just noise. They were noise she didn't have time for anyway. She had walls to build. Gustav Torgerson rebuilt his house in the summer of 1888. He used cordwood construction, the same technique Astrid had used, with the same sawdust lime cavity fill and the same double mortar courses. He had spent one afternoon before starting, sitting in Astrid's cabin with a piece of paper, asking her to write down the proportions. She wrote them down. He built the wall 20 inches thick on the north side, 18 on the east and west, 16 on the south. Birgit Torgersen told Marta Blumenkrantz about it, and Marta told Heinz, and Heinz came over one morning and watched Torgersen laying the first courses on the new foundation. He watched for about an hour without saying anything. Then he picked up a log end and looked at it, turned it in his hands, set it down. The following spring, he dismantled the east-facing wall of his frame cabin, the one that had cracked in the 1888 storm, and rebuilt it in cordwood, then the west. He left the north and south walls as frame for 2 more years, then rebuilt those 2. He never told Astrid Hagen she had been right about the walls. This did not surprise her or particularly bother her. She had not built the cabin to prove a point to Heinz Blumenkrantz. She had built it to get through the winter. Getting through the winter was the point. The walls had done their job, and the oilcloth package in the mortar cavity was still sealed in the south wall, and her father's letters and the deed to the farm she had not inherited, and the book her mother had given her were dry and safe inside the thing she trusted most. She had packed them in sawdust. She had sealed them with lime. She had put them in the wall. Erling Solberg died in 1978, 17 years after he bought the cabin for $50. His daughter, Ragnar Solberg Eriksson, was interviewed by a McHenry County newspaper in 1983, the centennial year of Astrid Hagen's homestead claim. She said her father had always said the $50 was the best money he ever spent, which she took to mean the cabin itself and the strange, dense, end-grain walls and the story he had assembled from the pieces inside them. He had gone to the State Historical Society to read what records existed on the Hagen claim and had found the Land Office file and a reference in the county history to the Norwegian widow who had sheltered Edvard Torgersen in the files. 1888 Blizzard. He had found a photograph, the only known photograph of Astrid Hagen, taken at the Bottineau County Fair in 1911, showing a woman in her early 60s, standing very straight, wearing a dark wool dress, looking at the camera with an expression that Ragnar Eriksson described as like she was assessing the quality of your foundation stones. He had framed the photograph and hung it on the wall of his workroom in Minot, next to the small photograph he had taken of the oilcloth package before he unwrapped it. When Ragnar asked him once why he had kept those photographs together, he said, "Because they're the same thing, the woman and the wall. You couldn't have one without the other." There is something worth knowing about the Norwegian building tradition Astrid brought with her, how old it was, how thoroughly tested, how far it had travelled before it arrived in McHenry County, Dakota Territory, in 1883. The Laftehus tradition in Norway traces to the Viking settlement period, 800 to 1000, 200 AD. By the time Astrid's father built his walls in Ål, Hallingdal, in the mid-19th century, Norwegian log construction had been refined over roughly 1,000 years of winters on a peninsula where the latitude reaches 71 degrees north, and the coastal climate brings temperature swings of 80 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit between July and February. A building tradition that has survived 1,000 years in that environment has been tested in the same way Astrid's wall was tested on the 12th of January 1888, by actual cold, actual wind, actual death if it fails. The builders who used bad mortar, cut corners on the double bead system, or used green wood found out within one winter. Their methods were not passed down. What Astrid carried across the Atlantic was not a style preference or an ethnic identity. It was empirical knowledge accumulated through the deaths and survivals of hundreds of generations of Norwegian farmers who built, failed, adjusted, rebuilt, and eventually converged on methods that worked because they had no choice but to converge. The saddle notch at the corner tight enough that chinking was not needed. The birch bark under the sod roof, waterproof, long-lasting, sourced from a tree that grows abundantly in subarctic conditions. The moss between the logs, sphagnum species, whose dried fibre has thermal performance comparable to manufactured insulation, as confirmed by University of Alaska engineers studying traditional Arctic building materials in the 1990s. Each element had been selected over time from the available options, and each had survived because it outperformed the alternatives in conditions that killed people. The American frontier, in the 1880s, was an environment with almost none of that accumulated selection. The Great Plains had been settled by Scandinavians, Germans, Czechs, Bohemians, African Americans from the post-Reconstruction South, and Yankees from New England, all arriving within a decade or two with building traditions suited to their origin climates and no multi-century record of performance against a Dakota Territory January. They built what they knew. What they knew in many cases was not adequate. The sod house was an exception, the one frontier construction type that had been forced into existence by the Great Plains specifically, with no Old World precedent, because the prairie offered nothing to build a conventional cabin from. Sod was the material the plains had, and settlers who used it fully thick walls, minimal openings, earthen floors created structures that performed thermally in the same range as Astrid's cordwood walls. They were cold and damp and dark, but they were not lethal. The problem was that sod was considered a temporary solution, a first-year expedient, to be replaced by a proper frame house as soon as the settler had the money. So the sod houses came down and the frame houses went up, and the frame houses racked in their joints in the first January storm with 60 mile-per-hour winds. Astrid Hagen had no intention of building a sod house. She had a method that worked better, and the materials to execute it, and the knowledge her father had given her. She was not making a cultural statement. She was solving a thermal problem with the best available solution. The fact that nobody around her recognized the solution was not her problem to manage. The January temperature readings were her problem. The wood supply was her problem. The door seal and the vestibule angle and the berm geometry and the depth of the root cellar, those were her problems, and she solved them. The cabin is still standing on the McHenry County Historical Society's registry, though it has not been maintained above structural minimum since the 1990s. The walls are intact. Lime mortar, in a low humidity climate, has extraordinary longevity. Documented cordwood structures in Quebec from the 1860s retain original mortar with no significant deterioration. The earthen berms Astrid built against the north wall have long since eroded, but the wall itself needs no berm. It stands 24 inches thick, end-grain cottonwood in lime sawdust mortar, holding the same air it held on the 12th of January 1888. The Vesterheim Norwegian American Museum in Decorah, Iowa, holds 3 items in its Hallingdal Valley collection. A bundle of water-stained letters in Norwegian, dated 1882, 1887, from Marte Armot of Ole to her sister Astrid in Dakota Territory. The handwriting on the envelopes is careful and slanted to the right, the penmanship of someone who learned to write in a Norwegian school in the 1860s. The last letter ends mid-sentence on the second page, the ink slightly smeared, as if the writer had been interrupted or had thought better of completing the thought and had sealed it anyway. The State Historical Society of North Dakota in Bismarck holds 1 Norwegian land deed and 1 Norwegian medicinal plant book, both preserved behind acid-free archival matting, both attributed to the Hagen family collection. McHenry County donated 1,961. Neither archive knew, for many years, that both sets of materials had come from the same wall, sealed in the same batch of lime mortar, packed in the same sawdust, on the same October afternoon in 1887 by a woman who was watching the meadowlarks fly south and thinking about what was coming.